Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Sunday School Dropouts podcast. And today we are really excited about our guest that we're having on the pod. It is
Yeah.
Dr. Celeste Holbrook. Um,
Yes.
and for those of you who don't know anything about her work, we're really excited to have her on. She is a sex
Yeah.
educator. We're going to be talking about purity culture.
Yes.
And
Which is so good. I think it fits, because we're talking a lot about like medical impacts, financial impacts, post-religion. I feel like everything we're talking about in today's conversation fits so well under the medical piece of like the impacts of high control religion. Um, because purity culture has literal physiological, medical impact on so many people coming out of those systems.
yeah, it really does. It really
Yeah.
does. And there's such a shame narrative around it, too, where it's like it just a lot of folks who struggle with this, it's like it just increases isolation and secrecy and shame. And a lot
Mhm.
of people don't feel comfortable talking about it. And so, yeah,
Yeah.
any chance we get to like start to have more of these conversations, I'm always here for it.
Yeah.
I was very
Yeah.
excited about it.
And I know she touches on it a little bit in that interview that we're about to have with her, but, you know, there actually is more research coming out all the time. I think starting in like 2021 and 2022 is when we first started to see studies that were coming out like with empirical, peer-reviewed research talking about how the impact that people are feeling from purity culture is very similar to that of a sexual assault survivor. And that's things like, sexual dysfunction, pain disorders, vaginismus, erectile dysfunction. And I didn't mention this, in our interview, but I was thinking back to the dissertation that I wrote, like my literal dissertation, not just like a blog post. There's actually also a lot of really good research around how just trauma in general can have impact on sexual function and seeing it as like sexual dysfunction simply because of trauma. And I feel like that also kind of plays into what we're talking about today. So maybe it's like, yeah, I don't really think purity culture impacted me that much, but maybe I did have some of these overwhelming experiences in a religious context. Maybe it was a more complex trauma and that you're suffering from or feeling the impacts from, and that can impact your sexual function as well, even if you've never had experiences of sexualized violence. And so I think it's like so connected and it's worth talking about because so many people are impacted by it.
They really are. I was even
Yeah.
thinking when we were talking about not even in a sexual context, but just being able to feel pleasure, being able to be sensual, just being able to notice
Mm.
things in your
Yeah.
body. And I just know how honestly, that is such a basic building block that so many people, and I'll even speak about myself back
Mhm.
years ago when I first started therapy before I was a therapist or anything, coming out of the church, like that, yeah, like I was so out of touch with even my own body, just in general, in the most general
Yeah.
sense. And so even just conversations around that, like just
Yeah.
noticing what things feel like somatically, physically, it's like
Yes.
that's just, it can't be overstated because it's just something that if you grew up in yeah, a high control system that
Mhm.
pathologized your body,
Yeah.
you probably are pretty out of touch with your body because you had to be safe.
Yeah. Yeah. So the last few days, I've been rereading some of my old journal entries from the last like 7, 8 years or whatever. And I had remembered this experience, but then I read about it kind of just haphazardly in my journal. And this was at least, oh gosh, at least 7 years ago, maybe a little bit longer. And I had just experienced what it felt like to have water hitting me in the shower. Like like all of a sudden I was taking a shower and I was like, "Oh my gosh, this is what it's like for water to hit your body. I get why people like taking showers. This feels really good." And it sounds so silly or simple, but like that's how disembodied I was, how frozen I was, that it took me, and at that point, I had been doing, like, somatic experiencing work as a client for probably 18 months, and then finally got to the place where I was, like, connected enough to my body, safe enough in my body, that I could feel the feeling of water, like, hitting various spots on my body, and it was great. I still love. To this day, years later, like, I always, like, just take a moment when I get into the shower, and I'm like, "Oh, this is what it feels like for water." to hit my body. And I'm like, oh, that feels so good. But that was like an experience not even available to me for the first, say 32, 33 years of my life. And it just goes, I mean, obviously I think that that's pleasurable. It doesn't have to do with sex, but like, yeah, the disconnection from our bodies, from pleasure, it's such a real thing.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's such a cool anecdote because yeah, I mean, it's something as simple as that. I mean, you probably have taken how many showers in your life, but it's like
Right?
until you're like have done some of that work and really sit there and can
Yeah.
appreciate it in a different way. Like it's really amazing. So
Yeah.
yeah, thank you for
I
sharing that.
love it. Yeah. Well, before we get into our episode today, I'll just give the normal disclaimer. Of course, we know that some of the things that we're talking about can bring up feelings, emotions, and triggers that can require more processing or might feel a little bit too much to handle right now. So please always feel free to skip any episode or parts of episodes and come back if and when you're ready, because our goal is to help you trust your own body and lived experience so you can take what you need and leave what you don't. Well, I think it is time for another vocabulary lesson, and this is a fun one. Because we're gonna talk about a couple terms and how they are different, the related, not the same, maybe the same. I don't know. Anyways, it is the concept or phrase of being trauma informed, and so we want to explore what does it mean to be trauma informed. How is that the same or different as being trauma trained? So, Andrew, I'm curious to know your initial thoughts because this was something that you had seen online, and I think I saw the same thread as you did.
Mhm. Yeah, I'm pretty sure I saw the thread on Threads. Interestingly enough, um, yeah, I'm newly on Threads. So if you're not there, come hop on over to
Yes,
Threads.
follow us both.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, so trauma informed is a phrase that between those two, I feel like that's the more commonly thrown around phrase, trauma
Yeah.
trained or trauma
Yeah.
informed.
Hmm.
Especially clinicians, practitioners, coaches, most everybody this day and age, I think will probably tell you they're trauma informed.
Hmm.
Um, in my understanding, my definition, trauma informed is really just meaning that oh, you're hopefully educated on trauma, how it can show up, what that can look like in
Yeah.
folks, and you're aware of that, and you're mindful of that when you work with folks and engage with them. Trauma trained means
Hmm.
you've actually literally been specifically trained in a trauma-informed modality of some sort, whether that be
Hmm.
EMDR, TFCBT. There's so many others, but those are just a couple of examples.
Hmm.
So to be trauma-informed does not necessarily mean you've been trained in anything. You can be
Right.
trauma-informed and not actually be trained. And then actually, unfortunately, the flip side of that can be true too. I mean, you can have gone
Yeah.
through a training, have the certificate, and
Not
not
be trauma
be
informed.
kind of a bull in a china shop and not actually be all that trauma-informed in
Yeah.
practice. So
Yep. Yeah.
anyway, that's my take on it. But
Yeah.
what
I
about you?
totally agree with that. I feel like trauma informed is such a buzzword nowadays. I mean, there's trauma informed, dentists. Well, actually, that's probably a really good thing. But, it's like I'm a trauma informed barista. I'm a trauma informed electrician, like that sort of thing. And you know what? Great. That is awesome. But I think that, yeah, like therapeutically or clinically speaking, being trauma informed means that you understand how trauma lives in the body and shows up in your physiology and how that shapes every aspect of you. So you don't just look at a person and say, you're depressed, you have a diagnosis of depression. You start going underneath that and get to the root of it. What is it that led to this result or this experience that this person is having? And then being able to create a treatment plan essentially and use modalities that help them, taking all of that into context. Um, and so while it's nice to say, oh, I'm a trauma informed barista, for example, I would be like, well, tell me why that matters. Is that different than just being like a compassionate, kind, respectful human being? Like, is that what you are? Or are you, when somebody orders their white mocha, are you digging into why it is that they wanted the white mocha and how that connects to their story and how they might be, acting or, ordering or anything like that? I don't know. Maybe you are, but maybe I'm overgeneralizing. I don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm trying to take back this term. Who knows?
I mean, and I will agree. I think it's I mean, I hesitate to say overused because I like that people are being mindful of wanting to be trauma informed. But
Yes, of
the problem
course.
is that I think that there are a lot of folks, that's now a buzzword, that are talking about it, that, and maybe even different practitioners that are implying that they are trauma trained or something, or, but I think sometimes the average audience member maybe doesn't necessarily know that nuance, the difference between those two, like to be
Hmm.
trauma informed. And if you're a therapist, oh, that means you've been trained and stuff. Not
Yeah, yeah,
necessarily. I went through 60 plus credit hours of grad school and there was nothing trauma specific,
yeah,
which
yeah.
is ridiculous. But that is unfortunately how grad school is. Like you might get
Hmm.
an elective, you might go do a conference or a workshop that's trauma specific, but
Hmm.
nope, you can get a master's degree and not have ever taken anything specifically about
Yeah,
trauma.
yeah. I took one class. It was required. I mean, I know we have different degrees. You're a professional counseling, and I'm marriage and family therapist. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I think as a marriage and family therapist, we were required to take one class. It was a trauma and crisis class where the majority of the focus was on crisis management, that sort of thing. And now I realize that I'm a dinosaur and went to school like in the ancient times. And so a lot has changed. But I mean, the way that they talked about trauma back then is not at all how we are understanding trauma today. But if you go into a lot of even master's degree and sometimes even PhD programs today, they're still not focusing on trauma the way that we are like in this conversation or in the extra trainings that so many people have gone to and given time, energy, and resource to become trained so that it's more than just the informed part, but it's actually the trained part. So yeah, I agree. Not everybody with some sort of an academic mental health degree would be trained and or qualified to be able to help somebody through trauma.
Yeah, and that's
Yeah.
interesting. You mentioning like the training with like the grad school and like crisis counseling and stuff, because like that's I hate this phrase, but back when they would always refer to trauma as big T or little T trauma, or
Yeah.
singular event versus complex trauma would be
Yeah.
I think, a better way. And
I
yeah,
agree very
I
much.
got that too. We would talk a lot about like the singular event stuff, like a horrible car
Mhm.
accident or like an assault, as like a very
Yeah.
specific
Yep.
an event that happened. But yeah, also the DSM-5, which is our current diagnostic and statistical manual. It's a very
Yeah.
restrictive definition of trauma.
Extremely. Yeah.
Um, and so it's like, and that when I was in grad school, that had just been published. So that was,
Okay.
I still remember having adjuncts and even associate professors that were having to go, in other words, trying to forget what they had learned from the DSM-4, update to the DSM-5, because there were some big things that changed. But I do remember trauma and the
Huge.
definition. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's still very restrictive, very
Yeah.
focused on the singular event type of trauma.
Mhm.
I would argue.
Oh, 100%. If you look in the DSM, you will not find complex trauma. And that's on purpose. Despite complex trauma having the most amount of research behind it than any other mental health disorder, they will not put it into the DSM because it messes up all of their other research, which is connected to big pharma and insurance and
Yeah,
all of the dollars, which is a total soapbox that I will get on in a side episode or something, maybe in
yeah,
a Sunday school class. But
yeah. I'm right there with you. I'm right there with you on that one.
yeah. But it is interesting because then when we talk about trauma trained, that would be, somebody, and it doesn't even have to be a therapist. It could be a coach. It could be some sort of other mental health practitioner. It could be a lot of people that have gone through specific training, I would say advanced trauma training that understands physiology, understands trauma in a more complex way and how it, uh, you know, can impact a person and then is also trained in that specific modality of how do we help somebody resolve it. Um, and, I know for myself, I know you, I know the practitioners at CTRR, one of the things that we can really promote well is that not only are we trauma informed and religious trauma informed, but we are all trauma trained. We all have training that helps us, helps us support clients in a more holistic way. But interestingly, I don't think that it means that you're trauma informed just because you have a trauma training either.
I agree. I agree. Yeah,
Yeah.
I very much agree. It's interesting too. I think one thing this is just personal anecdote. I don't know if there's research or how many other people would agree with me, but one of the biggest things for being trauma and truly being trauma informed is also, I think, just being curious and being willing to be flexible. Like being willing to learn from
Yeah.
your clients and being willing to recognize, okay, maybe some internalized bias that I didn't realize I had actually was making me not hear you the way I needed to. And being able to admit when you're wrong and then go do the work, do the
Yeah.
research on your own, do better. Like it's okay that there are certain experiences that you don't know a lot about, and then you've
Yeah.
realized that deficiency, and then you go do something about it. I think that could, because thinking you already know the answers about what your client's dealing with, even with trauma, when in fact you don't know what their lived experience is, I think actually is one of the most um,
Yeah.
anti-trauma informed approaches we can
Yeah.
take. And yet,
Yeah.
unfortunately, I've definitely seen that happen on more than one occasion.
Yeah, I've been the recipient of that. I had a therapist that now I would use this language that they were trauma trained, but they were not trauma informed. I didn't have the language for it back then, but this was somebody who I had found because I was like tiptoeing into this idea of like, I think there's maybe some trauma here, even though I didn't know a whole lot about it. And I rem- I had worked really hard to make sure all of my coping mechanisms were not destructive, right? I had engaged in all the destructive coping mechanisms before. And I'm not going to name them all because I don't want you to think that I'm judging you. But for me,
Yeah.
they were not helpful, right? They were things that like impeded me from living the way that I wanted to, right? And in a lot of cases, they caused more harm than they did good for me. And so I'd worked on really like getting rid of those and being able to replace them with things that felt much healthier and much more helpful and didn't have that long-term impact. And one of them was I read all the time. I'm a voracious reader. I always have been. I learned how to read when I was like 3.5 to 4 years old. Like that has been something that has saved me in a lot of ways. And I remember walking into like the second or third session with this trauma trained clinician, and I won't say what she was trained in either, but it was like a legit model and something that is very well known for working with trauma survivors. And I happened to share some anecdote of what I had read recently or whatever. And she looked at me and she says, "You have to stop that. You need to stop researching. You need to stop reading. I don't want you to do that anymore." And I remember thinking like, oh my gosh, you're taking away the only coping mechanism that I have in this moment. You're not helping me replace it with anything. You're not helping me feel safer. You're just telling me that this one thing that I have is not okay and I have to stop it. And so then what? I don't know how to survive otherwise, right? And so now I would say like that is deeply trauma uninformed, even though she was trained in a specific modality to work with trauma. And I don't think that I'm uncommon in that experience. I mean, I have many clients where they've had very similar experiences with other coaches and therapists and practitioners.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah. Ugh.
Unfortunately, me too. Well, no, I mean, and yeah, I've been on the receiving end of some of that type of stuff
Mm,
too, actually.
gosh. It
Interestingly
just
enough.
sucks. Yeah, because like I can think of many clients, I can pull them to mind right now. And the amount of just like work that we have to undo in order to get to a place then where we can work on the trauma in a way that feels safer and more effective for them. It's huge because there has been so much damage done by somebody who's maybe trained but not informed. Or vice versa, where they were trauma informed and then took somebody into an area that they didn't have competency to support a client through that.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, this is a whole soapbox
Yeah,
too.
it's a good.
Maybe we should
Yeah,
have
it could
like
be a whole.
offshoot small groups,
I,
community
yeah,
groups, and we
yeah,
could
yeah.
talk about that.
This is a good one. This is a good one. Well, it
I
was supposed
love
to be a
it.
segment. Wasn't trying to make a whole episode out of it, everybody. So,
True,
but a
true.
good,
So
very, very good conversation though to have.
yeah, we'll wrap it up there. And you know what? If you need people that are trauma informed and trauma trained, all the practitioners at CTRR are that. There's, tons of like just really, really incredible people. Link is in the show notes. Connect up with one of them.
Dr. Celeste Holbrook is a sexologist, speaker, and author who has dedicated her life to helping women achieve soul-centered sex through perfectly planned mental and behavioral changes. She inspires women to move through mental blocks surrounding their intimate lives to truly experience the sex that was spiritually designed for her.
Hundreds of women have dramatically changed their relationships by following the sexual and spiritual strategies that Dr. Holbrook has created and tailored specifically for them. Her favorite moment is the spark that appears in a woman's eye the instant her sensual confidence is reawakened.
Celeste was also a purity culture kid and had her own experiences of abstinence until marriage, keeping that commitment, and then navigating painful sex, the impact of purity culture, and untangling how all of this showed up in her body.
Today, we're excited to have Dr. Celeste with us to talk about the work that she does as a sex educator, helping women and couples find healing after purity culture, and most of all, learning to experience pleasure.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Yay, I'm thrilled. I am in amongst the legends. You had Erica, you had Phil, you had Dr. Tina Shermer Sellers, you had everybody cool. So I'm just like trying to keep up, man.
Snaps. Yeah. Love it.
Yeah, so excited to have you with us. So thank you so much. We'll just get right into it. I just would love to hear kind of a summary of your own, religious upbringing, kind of what experiences you have, like with purity culture and just all of that.
Yeah, well, let's just start them off easy.
Fair enough.
It was just like the real easy, like, what's your backstory? No, I love it. So I grew up in the Seventh-day Adventist tradition in a small town in Texas called Keene. And I grew up in a like the Mecca, the Mecca of Adventism. Besides Loma Linda, Keene is the Mecca.
Yeah,
but I grew up in a conservative community. My household itself was not incredibly conservative, but still definitely religious. And because I was a people-pleasing kid, I was your typical, want to please the adults around me type of human, made good grades because I wanted to make everybody happy around me. I went in hook, line, and sinker into, wait to have sex until you're married. I loved this message. It worked really well for me. I liked those very hard drawn lines. And to be honest, the opportunity to have sex was not available to me much anyway. So as like a 6 foot tall, like I was in a very small school, it just was not dating much anyway. So I was like, yeah, this sounds fantastic. I will, wait until I'm married to have sex. It sounds great. So I did. I waited till I was 26 to have penetrative sex when I got married. Got married in Austin in the morning because my daddy always said, if you get married in the morning and it doesn't work out, you haven't wasted the whole day.
Oh my gosh, that's amazing.
I know. Small town Texas, friends. Small town Texas. So got married in the morning, went over to our hotel room, took off my eyelashes and my fake hair and my Spanx and everything. And finally had penetrative sex for the first time. And it was terrible. It was awful. It was incredibly painful my first time. And I thought, okay, I'd heard people say it's can hurt the first time. So maybe this is just that. It wasn't fun. My partner was very sweet and kind, who I'm still married to, by the way. People always ask me this, like, are you still married to that guy? Yes. Yeah, he did not grow up in purity culture and was totally okay with going slow and, doing whatever I needed. So I just thought maybe I had like an old rusty vagina or something because I'd waited so long. I wasn't sure exactly what was going on, but I didn't know much about my body at all. I had not been given much comprehensive sex education, and I didn't know about arousal. I didn't know about my own body, my own clitoris, things like that. So I spent the first whole year of my life having terrible, painful sex and eventually not having sex at all. Went to an OB-GYN after the first year of marriage, and he did a full examination. And then he looked at me and he said, Celeste, I don't see anything really wrong here. I think what you need to do is have a baby. Which,
oh my gosh,
Just terrible
That's
advice.
the solution for everything.
Whoa.
For
Yeah.
everything. Yeah.
Babies do not fix anything, and especially not vaginismus, which was what I eventually figured out that I had. And at that point, I was like, I've just got to figure this out myself. Nobody's going to help me. And what I really needed at the moment was somebody to look me in the eye and say, I see that you feel shame about not being able to have pain-free sex. I see that you feel the pain physically and emotionally about not being able to have sex. I see that you feel angry at your partner whenever he wants to have sex because it feels like he wants to hurt you. I see that you feel just so confused. And so that's what I needed. So essentially, after that visit with the OB-GYN, I started a journey of becoming the person that I needed. So I gave myself the sex education I never got. I was already getting my PhD, and so I just added in health education, was my PhD's in health education. So I started adding like sexual health to that education, and eventually over time, learning about my body, undoing from the harmful messages I got growing up that were, sex is going to leave you unwantable, unlovable. You're going to go to hell. So I started unwinding from those. And eventually sex became neutral. And then eventually sex became pleasurable. And so I thought if I could do that for myself, maybe I could help. Maybe somebody else out there is struggling. And it turns out they were.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure were.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's kind of my story, where I came from and how it started my career. So in short, I am thankful for the experiences that I've had with vaginismus because it does help me identify and empathize with folks who do come in with things like painful sex or who grow up in purity culture. So for that reasons, I'm grateful, but it was a rocky road.
Ooh, yeah. I wish I could say that your story is like, blow me away. It's so different than anything I've ever heard. And, not to diminish anything you've gone through. It's just, I feel like this is so common and people don't talk about it. And that results in like what you've talked about, the shame, the resentment, the anger, the guilt towards yourself and towards other people because you're having this experience at the quote unquote right time, but it is not what you were taught it was supposed to be. So then you're also led to believe that there's something wrong with you versus the system that brought you up or the messages you were taught.
Yeah, exactly. It's such a double-edged sword of feeling shame for doing it. Like your body just can't, flip that switch, as we talk about a lot. And then shame that you're not getting it right. Like you get to lose all the time.
Yeah. You said your husband did not grow up in purity culture. How did that work for your relationship?
Oh man, he's just the best. I love that guy. Yeah, he didn't grow up in purity culture, went to church a couple of times growing up. And, when we first started dating, I was still pretty entrenched. And I said, hey, listen, this is what I want to do. I think I want to wait to have penetrative sex until you get married. And he was like, that's cool. That's fine. We can do other stuff. Like he literally didn't care at all. And I was like, oh, that's really different from any of the Adventist or Christian guys that I dated. I like this. And so, yeah, he was patient, of course. Also like real confused as I was like, why is this hurting her? Like, I hate that it's hurting her. Like, how do we fix it? Or how do we move through? And certainly never pressured me into anything. He's just like a really solid dude. Like I just lucked out. He's just a really, really solid dude. So he's been with me through it all. And at some point I was like, hey, I think I want to be a sex educator and like talk to other people about this. Like, how do you feel about me sharing my part of this story? And he was like, yeah, that's great. If that's what it takes, like, do it. It's fine. He's also an emergency room physician. And so like his version of normal is a little skewed also. So he'll be like, oh, I had somebody come in with this stuck up their butt today. Like, oh, did you give him good sex ed? He's like, no, that's your job. So,
just gives him a card.
Yeah. He's like, go see my wife for that.
Yeah.
So he's just rad. He's just a rad human.
Oh, that's so great. I
Love
think
that.
I think that, yeah, I love what you said. It's so different than, maybe other men who grew up in the church or Adventism specifically, just the response to it. And it's so different than the response we were taught men would have towards, engaging in sexual
Yes.
activity. So I just love to hear that it was consensual and respectful and eventually enjoyable.
Yeah. Yeah. And, he was obviously a huge part of that slow healing process. And I'm sure it was frustrating for him too, but he kept that to himself.
What a good man.
God bless
He
him.
should teach a class too.
Yeah, exactly. He reaped the rewards later, right? When I was fully healed. So he's good. He's fine, guys. He's fine.
It's so interesting because this is what Laura was saying a few minutes ago. Like this is just anecdotally, like, folks I've worked with through the years, like it's such a common story, and have like, you waiting till you get married and then like everything should be great because that's obviously the programming that we're told, whether it's Adventism or otherwise. It's like, that's just kind of the story. That's the narrative. And and interestingly enough, I've seen it both ways where on the one hand, there's folks who waited till they were married and then the experience is what you had. Right. And then it's like, why is this happening? This is not what I was told would happen. And there's a lot of shame around it. And then on the flip side, I've definitely seen folks who didn't wait, but then there's a lot of shame but are still in evangelicalism, purity culture. And so there's a lot of shame and secrecy.
Yeah.
And then suddenly they are in perhaps a marriage where, as far as the church is concerned, oh, you're good to go now. There shouldn't be any shame around it. And well, you can't just flip that switch. Like,
Right.
if you have this deep-seated shame response around sexuality and arousal and all of those things, like you can't just decide not to one day because you're doing it, quote, the right way. So yeah, it's such a thing. I just, the way that the way our nervous systems show up and just all of that. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I'm happy to hear you say your nervous system, because the way that I have kind of built the practice to help, especially women who are coming out of purity culture, is around safety, right? Because we can't get aroused unless we feel safe. And if the central message around sex is that it is harmful, your body continues to fear it, whether or not your brain has decided it's not fearful or to be feared, your body is still fearing it. So that might look like pain, like I experienced, that might look like low libido, that might look like low arousal or inability to get aroused or not having an orgasm. And so it shows up, this internalized fear of sex shows up in all of these little ways that a lot of times people aren't connecting back to their purity culture roots. But it is all rooted around the idea of safety, right? So we see this in our trauma survivors, sexual abuse survivors. We also see it in our purity culture survivors, which is, as you always talk about, is a form of trauma. So we work in the practice on establishing safety in sex first, and then establishing pleasure, belonging, and the other things that go along with sex.
Yeah. I like what you said there, and want to hit on that for a second because, one of the things I know I think Andrew's seen this too, many of our other practitioners, this idea that, it's anecdotal, but I think it's being confirmed by research currently, is just kind of this idea that purity culture survivors often have the same symptoms and responses as survivors of sexualized violence. And so I'm just curious to know if that's research that you've kind of read, if you picked up on that in client sessions, how it shows up in the clients that you work with. I'm interested to know what you have to say about that.
Yes, I haven't come across a ton of reliable data sets about it. I think Hillary McBride is doing some data sets that are qualitative data sets that will work well. But just as far as anecdotally, the qualitative data that's coming to me from people is that they are very similar, is that people are showing up with vaginismus, with painful intercourse, with low libido, who have experienced both of those things. And at least that's something that I see in the practice that probably you both see too.
Yeah.
There's just so many similarities. And I think because it's rooted in unsafety, the body feeling unsafe.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that, I love what you're saying there. Like it is rooted in the unsafety, like the overwhelm of the nervous system and then causing these responses even long after somebody may have cognitively rejected
Yes.
what the purity culture rules are.
Yes.
It's that embodiment piece.
Yeah. Yeah. So I like
Yeah.
to talk about harm reduction approaches for sex in working with a client, helping them together. We establish, okay, what would feel really good before sex? What would feel really good in your aftercare practice? What kind of sensations maybe feel novel and safe? What kind of sensations feel unsafe, right? So we kind of break it down and make a harm reduction plan for sex that can help them move slowly or at their own pace into more pleasure with respect to what has a possibility for harm.
Yeah,
Mm.
I love
Mm-hmm.
that. Do you find that clients have an idea of what some of those things could even be, like in terms of safety, pleasure, too much? Like I'm thinking about how, I'll just speak for myself. So thinking about, whenever I first kind of started tiptoeing into this area of like sexual activity, I had no connection to my body or what felt good or safe or what was a no for me.
Yeah.
And yeah, I'm curious to know, is that something you see? And if so, how do you tiptoe into that with clients?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And the typical answer is no. Most people are real cautious and
Sure.
unaware, not embodied in this way, in this particular way, and that's why they're here to see me. So I I do a pretty thorough assessment coming in of like kind of the history, like your what we call in my practice a deconstruction, which would be like me asking questions about how you grew up, not in any way in depth like you guys do because I'm a sex educator. Like I refer out all the trauma stuff to y'all. But I
Thanks.
do, yes. But I do want to kind of know what's going on and which of that earlier voice, that earlier child is showing up in her bedroom as an adult. And so some of the things we do to help with that is start with something accessible, like how do you want to feel in sex versus what do you want to do? So we think about sex in
I love
terms of
that.
behavior all the time. And in reality, we're doing all the behaviors because we want to feel something. So I start out the session with how do you want to feel? You want to feel loved, safe, connected, intimate, wild, dominated, submissive, whatever it is. How do you want to feel? And then we take and we build behaviors underneath that. So if she says, or if they say, I want to feel connected. Okay, great. That's perfect. Let's talk about that. Tell me in your life what helps you feel connected to your partner when we have a conversation. Great. So maybe let's start sex with verbalizing. Let's start sex with some conversation. Like, here's some things you can talk about. So we start with something really accessible. What do you want to feel? And then we build behaviors underneath that. And that typically helps gain access into sensation. It helps a client gain access into behavior that isn't taught before. And obviously I make suggestions, and that's the role of a sex educator, is to lay out and educate, and then they can pick up what feels comfortable.
I love that.
I love the focus just on the feeling, the felt sense. Like that's so important. I think like it's something that and of course I've come from Adventism too, but I imagine purity culture of any flavor, it's like we've been so conditioned to be divorced from our bodies. Like you just don't well, what do you want to feel? And so many times it's like, that's not even, I don't even know. Like,
Yeah.
like the first time I ever heard that question, like, what are you feeling or what do you want to feel? Or like the question of like, well, where do you feel that in your body? Like, okay, so you're happy. How do you know you're happy? What's actually happening in your body physically right now? And it's like, I have no idea. And it's like, so I just love that being a focus because it is something that's just so needed, and helping folks just get in touch with what even is happening physically in your body, right now. And
Yeah,
So
I love that
I
you say it
appreciate
because
that.
I think it is a struggle of a lot of so many people in and outside of purity culture. And I think when you can access it in this very vulnerable space, like when you are naked, when you are vulnerable, like I think it grows roots into other spaces. Like if you can access your body in here, I can maybe access it in the gym, or I can maybe access my confidence to ask for the raise, right? Like I do think it grows roots. When you build it in a vulnerable space, it can grow roots into other spaces. And I think that's like a little side note of cool things that happen in sex ed.
No, I think so too. I mean, this is a total tangent, but I have long said in a variety of different ways that I think that sex or sexuality is the church's biggest competition.
Yeah.
And that's why they're so against it and put all these restrictive rules around it, because there is something, it's core. It's the central feature of who we are as individuals. And I'm not just talking about who, two people who have sex with one another. Like it encompasses so much more, like your sexuality, it's your passion, it what drives, what's important to you, all these wonderful things. But when you can tap into that, you don't need external authorities to tell you what to do. You don't need them to guide you. And you certainly don't need the shame that is heaped on you when you don't follow the rules that they prescribe for a problem that they've also created. um, and so it seems, and I think that's, obviously that was not afforded to so many people coming out of religion and purity culture. And yet it is like this, like you're saying, this centralized aspect that when you can tap into that, your whole life has the ability to kind of open up into so much more than you've ever been able to experience.
Yeah, I love that. It's just so rad. And it's something that I think a lot of people coming into the practice don't even think about. Probably coming into your practice too. They don't associate that, or like don't think that's a possibility or would happen, or isn't even as a thing that could happen, but it does.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I love that. So, going back just a little bit to kind of some of the sexual dysfunction or symptoms that you see in your office or with clients that you're working with, when you think about purity culture specifically, what are some of the things that you're noticing the most in terms of symptoms, sexual dysfunction, with individuals and with couples?
Sure. So one of the things that I think helps most couples when they come in, and I love seeing couples. I love seeing couples in the practice. I see a lot of cis hetero couples. One of the biggest things that is almost immediately helpful and is hard to hear for some people is for the male in the partnership. Again, I see mostly straight cis hetero people. For the male in the partnership, the best thing he can do is start to unwind from the idea that sex is his place to emotionally regulate.
Ooh,
Right?
that's huge.
So
That's
that is
huge.
something like that is pushed in purity culture. Like men need sex to feel better. And men will often come into the practice like, I just feel better with sex. And I believe you. I absolutely believe you. Yes, sex helps you feel better, right? Because the world has told you that you need to put on a mask that's basically sturdy and protective, sometimes angry, but never sad, never like overly happy. Like you have to be just this very flat version of things in your outside world. But in sex, you can be tender, you can be fragile, you can be soft, you can be rough, you can be your whole expression of self. And that feels really fucking good, right? And so no wonder you lean into sex. No wonder you want more sex, because this is the area in which you are seen as your full humanity. And so many times men will say in the practice, I just want to be desired. And what they're really saying, I want my partner to desire sex because that's where I feel fully human.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah. I'm thinking back, sorry, not to cut you off. I'm thinking
Please.
back to like other therapeutic training I've had. I'm sure you're familiar with EFT, emotion focused therapy, Sue Johnson. One of the things she talked about was that if sex is not happening in a like heterosexual relationship, it is because of the man not feeling worthy enough. And what you're saying is kind of indicating that same thing of like, I need this to feel worthy, to feel loved, accepted, all these things. And if you shut me down, that makes me feel unworthy. It makes me feel unloved, undesired. So eventually I pull all that back because it feels too vulnerable to ask for that and to have that shut down because of everything that is wrapped into sex, right?
Yes.
So if you say no to this act, then you're
saying no
also
to
saying no to me.
my
like
whole
as
self. Yes.
Right. Yeah. That's so interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting and it's big and it's hard to hear for a lot of men, but also I see a lot of like, oh, you get me, right? Like I have people come into the practice who are high achieving men, right? Who are pilots, who are physicians, who have these really high expectation jobs that they have to be perfect for, right? You want a perfect surgeon. You want a perfect pilot. And so in sex, when you can be creative and imperfect and kind of wild and a healthy sense of irresponsibility, like these men are leaning into sex to fulfill kind of this, to round out what is expected of them up here, right? And so sometimes when I'm looking at them and saying like, you're required to be perfect in all other aspects of your life, and sex feels really good because you don't have to be that way, they're going like, oh, right, they're getting it. So the biggest thing that I think men can do to help their own sex life is to learn how to emotionally regulate and be seen as a full human outside of sex. So sex now becomes this place where we go for pleasure and connection. It's lighter, it's easier, it's accessible, right? And so that's one part of the purity culture stream. And then the other side for women, right? Purity culture wants us to serve. So we're taught to fear sex, not to lean into sex for regulation, but to fear sex because it's going to make us unwantable, unlovable if we don't do it in the right context. And we're taught to serve. Like your highest goal is to serve others. So when you have men who are taught to need sex and you have women who are taught to serve with sex, this becomes a very tumultuous sexual experience because sex starts to feel like an obligation. Sex starts to feel like a chore. And sex isn't pleasurable. Sometimes sex is painful. And so her work is to learn how to unwind from the idea that sex is a service, because sex is not a need, right? So these are the big things. You can't hit them with the big things like all at once in the first session, but that's where we're going, right? That's what we are working to understand. And the couples who really lean into this get to a place where they're having regular sex in a frequency that works for both of them, that they negotiate. And I always say good negotiations leave both people a little disappointed and a little happy.
Yeah.
So they're doing fun things in their sexual experience. They have pleasure, they have connection, but it's not an obligation and it's not a need. And that's where we want to go with a lot of the couples that are coming out of purity culture, to round back to your original question.
Yeah.
That's such a helpful answer. All of that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Do you see those two roles that you talked about, like the service and then perfection, does that play into sexual dysfunction? Like I'm thinking specifically for women like vaginismus, or for men, erectile dysfunction. Do you see those playing into the overarching messages?
Yes, I definitely do. Especially, you mentioned ED, erectile dysfunction. A lot, there's like basically two-ish reasons people get ED. One is like low blood pressure, which can be caused by blood pressure medications or, health indications. And then there is a pressure to perform, and lots of times they're intertwined, right? So if a penis owner can get erect at nighttime, but not when they're with their partner, or they can get erect with masturbation, but not with a partnered scenario, then we know there's some pressure to perform that's happening that's causing some of that ED. And it does come from this kind of societal pressure to be everything. Like we give no allowance, especially for privileged white men, which are a lot of the people in my practice, right? We give two shits about them because they've ruined everything, essentially. So we don't like talk to them like they're real people, but they're like, they're coming into the practice and they're experiencing ED, or they truly want sex to get better, but don't know how to do it. But if we recognize that there's just a lot of pressure for them to be woke, and for them to be all of the things, and for our providers and our champions and our protectors, and also like you get to have pleasure too. Like this is available to you as well, and we want that for you. This is the liberation of us all. And so we see a lot of ED in that case. On the other side, with vaginismus or painful intercourse, there is a lot of that intertwined with the role of service, the role of or fear, because essentially, and I know most people are not watching the video. Essentially, your pelvic floor is contracting, right? So here's my pelvic floor. This is a vagina model. So all of these orangey red parts are your pelvic floor muscles, right? And so when you are fearful, they're all contracting up, and so that makes sex really painful, or possibly penetration not available. And so like pelvic floor therapy and sex therapy, sex education can help you understand how to loosen up those muscles and feel more safe, so penetration is more available to you. So yes, ED, vaginismus, painful sex, we see them definitely intertwined with these socializations of sex in purity culture.
That's so helpful. Thank you. Yeah.
And I appreciate too, even like just touching on like how it affects men as well, because like just anecdotally, I mean, being a therapist, coach, all the things, I'm not like a sex expert by any means. So that's not specifically what like men, for example, come to me to work with. But I can also say almost 10 out of 10 times it ends up going there.
It
not
comes
as
up.
the sole focus, but it becomes a very big thing. And so, it does just show up. And then just the purity culture dynamic, like what you described earlier, like it's just such this almost like this enmeshed or codependent dynamic where there's like expectations that purity culture programming have given everybody of what to expect, and how so much of their self-worth is wrapped up in how they are able to show up in that regard, and then not being able to. It's like the shame piece just shuts down so much. And I again, anecdotal, but like I see that so much. And so I just appreciate you speaking on it, but also just laying it out in such an understandable way that, I mean, I think anybody listening to this can be like, oh my gosh, that makes so much sense. Like why this dynamic is playing out the way that it's playing out.
Yeah. I'm so glad. Yeah. I'm so glad it makes sense. Sometimes I'm like, I don't know if this even like, is this working or not? I don't know.
I think it totally makes sense when like you said, you start at this like basic physiology, and through the lens of the nervous system, safety, physiology, I mean, all of this makes so much sense. And then you layer onto that like this, whether it's the Bible or some other holy text or pastor that are like ingraining these messages of this is bad, you're a monster, you're out of control, whatever. Absolutely, then your body is going to have the physiological responses or lack thereof as a result of these experiences, even though they might consciously, again, be like, no, this is okay, but my body believes something different.
Yeah. I often talk about how you wouldn't get an erection, or you wouldn't get like aroused as a vagina owner or a vulva owner when you're running away from a lion. Like it would just be physically impossible. You would never, your body overrides your arousal and shuts it down. And that's exactly what's happening with your ideas around sex from purity culture.
Yeah. Oof.
Yeah, I think so. We've definitely touched on it and maybe already answered this question a little bit, but I really want to kind of double down on with the way this affects couples. So like the way that we see purity culture is having what lasting influence or impact do you see that having with couples, meaning in ways that are like detrimental or unfavorable? Like What influence do you see in the long term?
Yeah. A lot of people wait a really long time to get help for their sex life. And so, like, I'll see, and I'd love to hear your perspective on this too. So I'll see people who have struggled with sex from day one and they've been married 10 years, 20 years. And I think part of that is from purity culture that we're not going to talk about it. Like if we loved each other enough, or if we were hot enough, or whatever, socialization that's in their brain keeps them silent about it and keeps them from asking for help, which is why I love podcasts like this. Right? Is so that people can hear in their earbuds that struggling with your sex life after growing up in a religious system is very common, is so common. So I think silence is the first thing. The shame of it keeps people silent about it. And I tell people all the time, the only people that are talking about their sex life are typically the ones who think they have a great sex life. Like we don't typically hear from our friends who are struggling unless they're really close friends. And so it's just not something that we share very much around, which is okay, right? We want privacy around our sex life, but we also want support around it. So I think many, many couples feel like they struggle with frequency arguments, I should say. I think very many couples struggle with frequency arguments if they have or have not grown up in purity culture. The ones that grow up in purity culture, I think, struggle with frequency arguments possibly more because sex has been put on a pedestal. Like sex is this one thing. This is the only thing that you can do that's different than what you would do with your friends, right? This is like the thing that makes your relationship different. And you could only do it within this, like it's just put on this huge pedestal. And so the pressure to have regular sex, the pressure to have good sex, I think is increased in purity culture couples, which makes it hard when things get hard. So I think the pedestal, the silence, the pedestal, and just some of the things we've talked about before, sex being sold as a need for men and sex being sold as a service to women to do for men.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with, so much of what you said. And it strikes me too that when we're taught these very specific roles and contexts for sex, inside of a high control religion and purity culture, like, it has to look this very specific way. And when it does, then it's going to be amazing. So there's like the promise attached to it that, yep, you have to wait for 20 or 30 or however many years, and then it's going to be amazing. And because I feel like the way that so many fundamentalist religions operate, there's also this recognition that if that thing, whatever that thing is, goes wrong, the promised reward, that it is definitely not the system, it is definitely not the rules, it is definitely not the institution, it is the individual. Mm-hmm. So I think that happens even outside of purity culture. You might say, like, I don't believe that, but then if I'm not having good sex, it's definitely me.
Yes.
It's not my past. It's not, whatever. It must be something that I'm doing wrong. I feel really ashamed. It's like I self-isolate, and then that comes out in my relationship too. And maybe my partner's feeling the same way, or maybe they're not. Who knows? But we'll never know because we're not talking about it,
right. Right.
And there's so much that can be untangled by just like leaning in, but we're so like made to believe like this is a me problem. I've got to work it out within myself, so that it doesn't affect the outside world or the relationship.
Yeah. Oh man, I see this happening so much with couples where only one of the partners will come in because this is something that I am struggling with. I am struggling with low libido. I hear this all the time. I am struggling with low libido. And I always gently encourage, like, hey, do you think your partner might want to come to a session sometime? Because sex is between the two of you. And nobody set the bar on libido, right? Libido is just libido. There's not such thing as a high or a low. There's just sex drive. So very often one of the partners is taking on the role of fixing sex by themselves. And I think that's very, very common.
Ah, so much. Well, I'm like, there's so many more questions that we could ask, but I want to get into a little bit of like pleasure talk, because I know that that's something that you talk about a lot. And, I, also want to give the hope, but talk a little bit about like, what does purity culture get wrong about pleasure? And then how do you help people kind of tiptoe into pleasure as they're coming out of these messages and practices?
So I think purity culture teaches that pleasure is like a side hustle. Pleasure is an option. Pleasure is not required, right? Because we're teaching that men regulate with sex, so that's like a requirement. And we're teaching that women serve with sex, so that's like an obligation. But nowhere in there have we taught that sex is for pleasure and connection. But 98-ish% of the sex that happens is for pleasure and connection. It's not for reproduction. It's not for anything other than we want pleasure and connection. And so in purity culture, pleasure is so overlooked that it feels like it is superfluous. It feels like it is almost selfish, right? We associate pleasure with hedonism. We associate pleasure with selfishness. When in reality, the idea of being sensual is just using your senses. Like we can be sensual right now, the three of us, by like feeling the chair underneath our butt and like feeling the air around you and listening to the voices, right? So pleasure is built into our bodies and in every second way. And in a way, purity culture tells us to ignore all of those signals, to disembody, to live outside of your body in a very cognitive, logical space. And so a lot of people coming out of purity culture, I'm sure you see this so much, have a hard time, which we kind of talked about earlier, feeling your actual body, because there's been so much messaging around around othering your experience. And so, I think purity culture essentially erodes the idea of pleasure, that it's even something that we would want to strive for. And so building your pleasure practice back up can start from just a noticing practice, in sex, we talk about anchoring into the feel of the sheets on your skin, the feel of your partner's lips, the sound that a kiss makes, the fragrance of your partner's, not breath probably, but like skin maybe.
Sure.
Even then,
their
we
cologne,
can get sensual.
Their perfume. Yeah.
Your breath is exquisite. I love it. Right. And so just anchoring into one of those things. And sometimes that's the hardest practice, is to really focus on what I'm feeling in this moment, in this sexual experience. What does that pleasure feel like?
Yeah. I love that.
Yeah. I've definitely seen and heard like folks, well, both personally and personal anecdotes, but professional anecdotes from folks I've worked with where, pleasure is just so pathologized from with purity culture backgrounds, where it's like, that's not the goal. Like you said, that side hustle, that was a good analogy, because it's like, it's fine if it happens in the right context, but that should never be the primary focus, right? Like that's oftentimes what folks are told, I think. And, and I even heard this from this was from an Adventist person doing a health seminar many years ago. But the whole idea that, in a marriage anyway, that God desires holiness, not happiness. i.e.,
yes.
pleasure is irrelevant.
Yes.
Pleasure
Gary
is irrelevant.
Thomas. Yeah, literally wrote a book about that. Yeah.
Well, maybe they were
Holiness, not
quoting
happy.
him, which is,
Oh, Lord have mercy. Holiness, not happiness.
Even as a teenager, I remember thinking, I'm like, and I was still very
Yeah.
much in the church at that point in my life. Like I was trying to be, but even then I'm like, that just feels gross. And I'm not sure why, but even as a kid, I'm like, ugh, that doesn't sit right. But, oh, it runs deep though, that
It
programming.
does. It does. Yeah, it does. Like I have a whole like club called Pleasure Club where it's just a bunch of women learning how to experience pleasure. Not even really, we talk about sex a lot, but like not even really in sex. Like what actually brings you pleasure? Like start to notice this, right? It's like a whole thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and even I led a purity culture support group a couple years ago. And, one of I waited until everybody joined the group to kind of determine the direction based off of what their needs were. And so it ended up being a lot about sexual pain. And we started to introduce the concept of pleasure. And all of them initially were so terrified. They were like, no, 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 no. I don't want to talk about pleasure at all. And I was like, okay, I'm not going to actually introduce any sexual pleasure. Like, we're not going to do any like titrated experiences, like even with your body, anything like that. We're going to talk about just like pleasure in general. Like, what is it? What does a piece of chocolate taste like? Or something like that. What is it like to have your hand touch your other hand? Right. And it was this profound thing of like recognizing, oh, first of all, sex and pleasure are very overcoupled. But this idea that I can only have pleasure and sex and I don't like sex, so therefore I can't have pleasure. I mean, it's like, it's very real.
Yes. Yes. I really like how you talk about overcoupling of sex and pleasure. Like we need to talk more about that.
Yeah. Right? Yeah, because it's like, I mean, that is a way that you could have pleasure, but there is so many others and should be, and again, this is one of the faults of purity cultures among many is that, yeah, like our bodies are not sources where pleasure can happen, whether that's tasting something, smelling something, feeling something, hearing something. And so we have this very limited view of what that is. And then it becomes very scary because why would I, want to essentially then overcouple pain and pleasure?
Yeah.
And I'm not talking about sexual pain in a way that sometimes people enjoy it.
Sure, sure.
I'm talking about like, ouch, like
Yeah.
this, I'm in dire pain and this isn't feeling good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that's so good. That's so good. On a side note, and maybe you include this, maybe you don't, but on a side note, there is some really beautiful work in the BDSM community around reorganizing the way you feel about pain and creating wanted pain around it. So there's really great, interesting, good work in the BDSM community that I think is very fascinating if you ever wanted to explore that a little.
Very cool.
Yeah.
I think that'd be a great resource for people.
I'm curious too, what, on the subject of pleasure, what role does self-pleasure play in like healing sexual dysfunction, would you say?
Oh man, that's such a great question. So here's one of my frustrations is that sometimes I'll get people in the practice who say, I went and saw a sex therapist or I went and saw a practitioner, and they're just like, just go, like we'll say they're anorgasmic. Maybe I have an anorgasmic client who hasn't had an orgasm ever. And she comes into the practice and she says, well, I went to like several other sex therapists and they just recommended this big vibrator and said I go use it. Yeah. And I feel really uncomfortable with that, right? And that's why I feel like it's really important to have culturally competent sex educators who can work with people who are either still in the system, if you will, right? And meeting them and being culturally competent enough to meet them where their ethic lies, right? So I'll still have clients who say, my ethic says, we talk about building a sexual ethic, and they come all the way around to, I still don't want to touch myself. That's not within my ethic. Okay, great. That's beautiful. I love that you created that on your own outside of the system and you came back around and this is still where you are. Great. Let's work within that, right? It's frustrating to me when I hear practitioners, not you guys, of course, but there are practitioners out there who don't study purity culture enough to know that you can't just haul off and throw a vibrator at somebody who grew up in purity culture and expect them to be okay with that. That is causing harm. So when we get people in the practice, I definitely ask everybody in a second session or sometimes in a first session about their masturbation practice. How do you feel about touching your genitals? What is that experience like for you? Historically, have you ever done it? Tell me more about this. And so you'll get a wide range of, I remember rubbing on a pillow when I was 7, but then somebody told me not to, or told me that was gross and I never did it again. Or I remember getting myself off in the bathtub, or when I was a teenager in college, and ever since then, I've only done it this one way and it feels great and I feel safe with it. Okay. So you get all of these all this information about a masturbation practice, how they feel, what is their relationship with their vulva, what is their relationship with their penis. And from there, we build a safe way that reduces as much harm as we can reduce, right? There will still be uncomfortable feelings, but we build a safe way to self-pleasure, because self-pleasure is the safest pleasure, right? There is always risk when you're with somebody else. There's no such thing as safe sex. There is safer sex, but it always comes with risk, even if it's just risk of embarrassment. So we work towards building a practice of masturbation that feels the safest for them, because that is truly one of the best ways to informed consent, right? If we know our body, we're informed on our bodies, we can then give informed consent for somebody else to touch our bodies. And that's keeping it, again, I work in the framework of safety, and harm reduction. So this is the best way to create safety around touch for somebody else. So a masturbation is a practice that my wish for the world, if I was in a beauty contest and say, what is your one wish for the world? My wish for the world would be that everybody felt comfortable in masturbation.
I love that.
Would I win the beauty
world
contest?
peace, yeah.
I mean, that's the way. That is the way.
Yeah.
Masturbation is the way to world peace, friends.
There we go.
So it is a beautiful practice that I want to continue to encourage, but you will come up against barriers of people who are just not there and maybe never get there. So we just figure it out around that, and that's okay. That's being a culturally competent practitioner.
That's so good. Well, I want to be respectful of your time. So as we wrap up, one of the last questions we, like to ask is, what are some things that you wish people coming out of purity culture could know that might help them, as they navigate life post purity culture? Maybe they've only been out one day. What are some of the things that you want them to know?
I want people to know that sex is not an emergency, that you have a lot of time to have a lot of sex. The studies out of IU, they asked people who were towards the end of their life when the best sex was that they had. And the average answer is in the 50s. In their
I love it.
50s. So you have so much time. You can go slow. You have time to figure it out. You have time to explore. You have time for it to be terrible and then get better again. Like, it's just not an emergency. And you just be patient with yourself. And good sex is on the horizon, and it's worth the work.
I love that. It's so good. Well, I'm so glad that we could have you on the podcast today. It's been such a great conversation, and I feel like there's more that we could talk about. Even that last thing that you said, I was like, oh yeah, I always tell that to people too. Like, slow the reins. So there's so many more things we could talk about.
Yeah.
But that just gives people more encouragement to go and follow you on social media and get in touch with you. So if people want to do that, where can they find you? And how can they get in touch with you? Maybe they're wanting to work with you. What does that all look like?
Yes, I will tell you all those things. But first, let me tell you that I love you both, and you are a delight. And you are doing good work, and the world needs every single thing that comes out of your mouth and out of your written word. So keep going. I recognize from one practitioner to 2 others that this work is fucking hard. So Big,
Yeah.
deep breath.
Yeah.
We're going to get through this together. We're going to help the people, and we're going to take care of
Yes.
ourselves. And I just want you to know that I see you and you belong in this
Thank
space.
you. Yes.
Thank you.
You're
Yes.
welcome.
Yeah.
You can
Thanks.
find me at Dr. Celeste Holbrook on the socials. It starts with a DR, Dr. Celeste Holbrook, and drcelesteholbrook.com, where I do couples and individual sex ed sessions. And I also lead classes and do presentations. So if you'd like for me to come speak to your women's book club, we can do that. We can talk about like romance novels and, smut and vibrators and like literally give me a topic and we will just go.
That is the best girls' night ever.
Yes.
Everybody needs to go follow you. And yeah, I'm just so thankful for the work that you are doing. This has been such a great conversation.
Well, I appreciate you both. Thank you so much. And please, let's do it again. I would love this. I mean, like, this is my favorite thing. So anytime.
Yeah,
Awesome.
you'd love to.
Thank you. Thank you once again to Dr. Celeste Holbrook for joining us for another fabulous conversation. I'm just so grateful that she could be with us today. There was so much, even towards the end, I was like, oh, I want to talk about this and this and this. But there's just so much great information in what she was talking about. I really appreciated the perspective she took and the education that she does with her clients. Yeah, so much goodness in there.
Yeah, gosh, I agree. It's like the more we've and the more that we've just in general talked about purity culture and sexuality and all of these things, the more I'm thinking like honestly doing an entire series on purity culture specifically, I
know.
think could be so helpful because you're right. There's so much more. Like every
I
little
think
like
so too.
rabbit trail we went down. I'm like, no, but there's all these other things that we could talk about too. And
Yeah.
but I'm just grateful that we're having the chances to have some really cool conversations with some pretty amazing professionals in this field because it's
Yeah.
such a needed conversation.
Maybe season 3 needs to just be purity culture central and all the things, because there are so many things.
Yeah.
I mean, and I know we've had some episodes last season. We have episodes this season, and like the connections that it has to diet culture, to fundamentalism, to racism, to patriarchy and gender roles. Like there is just so much, and just even in this little conversation of being like, hey, here's how purity culture could impact things like erectile dysfunction and vaginismus and sexual pain. Like those are conversations just themselves unto themselves. And I mean, I don't know that we have like firm numbers, but I mean, you kind of mentioned it. One of the things that you were saying, and I've seen this too, is like almost 100% of the clients that we're working with, even if they don't start off coming in specifically for the impact of purity culture, it always leads there in some way, at least in part.
Yeah, it really does. I mean, and of course, we were even in this context, we're speaking mostly to like, cis hetero couples, but also with like purity culture, the heteronormative sexual ethic. I mean, that
Oh my gosh,
shows up.
yeah.
I mean, that's a whole other thing too. I was just thinking that's like how many people knew they were queer since they were literally like 6 years old or something, and yet never were able to really do anything with that or because of the just being completely shut down by the shame-based messaging that they grew up in. And that's a whole other piece that so anyway, all of that to say in summary, I think all things pertaining to purity culture is a needed conversation. I don't know, it's almost like I don't think we could do enough.
Yeah, I think you're right. But this gets our wheels turning, for next season. And, and I would just encourage people to, continue, like go to Dr. Celeste's, not Facebook. Oh my gosh, Instagram. Since Andrew's the only one who does Facebook still.
No, I don't even do Facebook anymore, I'll be honest.
I'm just kidding. Who was it that was saying
I might still
they did
have one.
Facebook?
I might
was
have
it you?
one, but
Okay.
it was
I
not
can't
me.
remember.
Definitely was not me.
Somebody I was talking to recently was like, yeah, Facebook. And I was like, I don't think people do that anymore. But anyways, don't go to Dr. Celeste's Facebook. Go to her Instagram page and her website. You can work with her. And she has tons of great videos about different aspects of sex education and pleasure. So make sure to give her a follow there. And like we said, she takes clients as well. So if you're an individual, if you're a part of a couple, she's somebody who can, help you become educated and start tiptoeing into practices of pleasure and just decreasing shame and pain, which I think is so important.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. Well, I think that is the end of another great episode. So with that, all God's people said, amen.
Amen.